Stockport, Greater Manchester, January 7th, 2017. In 2017, a local housing association was doing a winter welfare check for Barbara's 99-year-old father. She made excuses of why they couldn't come, but her attempts had failed this time. They were on their way. The welfare check was for Mr. Kenneth Coombs, who served in WW2 and had many awards to prove it. I suppose he was looked at as a local celebrity of some sorts. She had told her brother years ago that their father had died of a heart attack, and the hospital had cremated him, knowing that their father wouldn't have wanted all that fuss. I wonder how Michael Coombs took this news. He was very close to his father, and his father loved to boast and brag about anything concerning his son. Even his bird-watching abilities that would take his son to West Africa. They were very close. She had managed to keep her lies and cross her T's and dot her I's. But the truth was gaining on her. It was about to be told. She took a deep breath and she headed to the police department. She would confess the crime, what she did. 12 years ago to that day, she had moved in with her father after separating from her husband. Her daughter, who was in her 20s, she came with her. Barbra Coombs says she'd been used all her life by her father. She had spent 40 years being his sex slave. She even birthed his child that died a few days later. Her father, Kenneth Coombs, had been extremely sexually abusing her, mentally and physically and emotionally abusing her. Was Barbra Coombs in this great time of need that she would move in with this man that have done all these unthinkable things to her? But she did. People that knew Mr. Coombs said in fact he was stern and strict, but that's one thing. Another man that grew up with Barbara and Michael, Roy Cosgrove, he said that Mr. Coombs was a great man. He called him uncle. He described him as generous and smart. He said Coombs had written a book about his time in the war. He said when his mom found out that Mr. Coombs had passed and that there was no funeral, she was quite upset. She said Ken had passed from cancer. Some that knew him described him as domineering and very difficult. People have witnessed Barbara and her daughter insulted and made to feel small and not important by Coombs. Combs' wife had even left him back in the 1970s, taking her sons. She would pass away shortly after that, but Barbara, she remained there. And after she married her husband, Bill Coombs, who would take her last name, the marriage ended 7 years later, and she went to stay with her father, Kenneth Coombs. So this stocky-built, white, curly-haired woman with black trimmed spectacles stood very still. There was no emotion. Receiving her sentence was going to be from the magistrate in Manchester, and she was ready for it. She closed her eyes and she thought about that moment that her 87-year-old father sat in the living room watching the television. Did you know her and her daughter would have to leave out the room when he wanted to watch a show? They couldn't even be in there. She sat and she watched him looking at the TV. She'd been outside gardening when she saw it. She saw it and she picked up the shovel and she entered the living room and she would strike him as hard as she could with the shovel. Her father had looked back at her like he was in a daze, and she would strike him a second time. She tilted the shovel and she sliced his neck. He fell to the ground and she watched him lay on the floor and he was bleeding out. As the photographs her father kept of the sexual abuse she had endured, the anger from all those years had built up, but it had finally turned to relief. She would roll his body up in the living room carpet and she would drag him to the garden and she buried him. She would tell his close friends and the family that her father had died. She had handwritten the letter and put it in her brother's letterbox explaining, about their dad's death. But there was no funeral. Again, their father wouldn't want a fuss like that. She would clean up the crime scene and she would continue gardening. She would decline all his future doctor's appointments and dentist appointments, and she collected over $190,000 in pensions. The residents at Matlock Road only knew that Mr. Coombs had disappeared, not that he was dead. Coombs' family had even went to apply for the death certificate, but there wasn't any. They blatantly asked Barbara, had she killed him? Maybe it was an accident, and she replied, quote, "That's an awful question," unquote. Barbra Coombs would receive 9 years. The judge thought that was the appropriate sentence. Some people say this woman had suffered such horrific abuse that it wasn't. Barbra Coombs, 9 years.